This video is part 3 in a series about the Super Nintendo's sound system, the SPC700. In this video, we'll be looking at how sound samples are handled by the hardware. We'll look at the BRR format, where BRR samples are stored, how they're accessed, and how they're decoded. And then we'll see how the DSP stretches and squishes these samples to manipulate their pitch via interpolation. Almost all of the sounds the Super NES produces comes from sound samples. A short audio clip of a sound, such as percussion instruments, voice samples,
Boom shakalaka!
Or more commonly, pitched musical instruments. They get played back at a very precise timing in order to create a rhythm. And they can be pitch shifted up or down to create different tones. The software, the sound engine program running on the SPC700, is ultimately what dictates the timing and when sound samples should be output to the speakers. This is done by writing to the K-on and K-off registers within the digital signal processor, or DSP. There are also pitch registers that will determine the rate at which the sound sample will be played. However, it is the DSP that is responsible for taking the values in those registers and transforming the sound sample so that it can be played at a particular pitch at a particular time. But where does it get the sound sample data from? How does it know which sample to use? And how does it modify the speed at which the sample data is processed? Let's find out. But first, it should be noted that everything we're about to see in this video is implemented via hardware. There might be a lot of number crunching going on, but this all happens really fast. The SNES has a sample rate of 32 kHz, which means one pair of stereo audio samples are being fed from the DSP to the DAC, digital to analog converter, every 31.25 microseconds. The process we'll be looking at shortly will focus on just one of these samples and happens 32,000 times in 1 second. As mentioned in a previous video, sound sample data is held in audio RAM along with lots of other things. Also important is the sample directory, which is also held in ARAM. Sound sample data is stored in bitrate reduced format and can be anywhere in ARAM that it will fit. Multiple samples don't even have to be contiguous. They can really be wherever is most convenient. The sample directory, however, must be stored in a specific location. The DIR register in the DSP denotes which 256-byte page in ARAM the start of the sample directory can be found. This means that the directory must start at a page boundary. The directory is what contains the information about where all the samples are located in ARAM. Each sample requires a 4-byte entry into the directory. The first 16 bits are just a pointer to the start of the sample data within ARAM. The second 16 bits are a pointer to the start of the loop point of the sample. The loop point is just where to start repeating the sound sample if the end of the sample is reached. Conventionally, the loop point is somewhere within the sample itself, but there's nothing that requires this. The looped part of the sample can be stored in a different location than the non-looped part, and there is nothing stopping samples from sharing data either. There can be up to 256 different sample sources, so the directory can be up to 1024 bytes large. However, it only needs to be as big as needed, and the remaining space can be used by other things in ARAM. Let's look into the bitrate reduced format, or BRR for short. The name of this format is a slight misnomer. It would be more accurate to say the SNES uses ADPCM samples, which stands for Adaptive Differential Pulse Code Modulation. Bitrate reduction is just a general process that must be done to convert a recorded audio sample into this format, as the bitrate used is just 4 bits per sample point, pretty low. However, everywhere you look regarding SNES audio will get you BRR formatted samples, so let's just go with that. Pulse code modulation, or PCM, is a very common way to treat audio digitally. An analog signal has no discrete time steps and no discrete levels. It is continuous in both dimensions. PCM digital audio has a discrete time step, known as the sample rate, at which the analog signal is sampled. Then, it also has a discrete value at each time step, known as the quantization step. Because our bit rate is 4 bits per sample point, this means each individual sample point can take on one of 16 values, -8 to +7. While we can reconstruct a digital signal back into an analog signal with the help of a DAC, we do have a loss of quality when we reduce our bit rate down to 4 bits per sample point, hence BRR. The differential in ADPCM comes from the fact that samples can be differentially coded. I'll touch on this more in a bit, but essentially a higher resolution can be achieved by using previous sample points to help predict what the next sample points in the overall sound sample will be. And then the adaptive comes from the fact that we can change what the quantization step is throughout the length of the sound sample. For example, most instrumental sound samples will start with a louder attack, which requires a higher range and therefore a coarser resolution. Then as the sound tapers out, a lower range is required, which can help increase the resolution around the 0 point. BRR samples are formed from many smaller blocks that are 9 bytes long each. The first byte in the block is the header byte, followed by 8 bytes holding 16 sample points. Each individual sample point is 4 bits, like previously mentioned. Again, these sample points are treated as signed values ranging from -8 to +7. The header contains a bit of information about this block. The first 4 bits are the shift value. This is what determines the size of the quantization step for the sample point values within this block. Internally, the sample points are going to be treated as 15-bit signed numbers, so this value is the number of bits to shift the BRR sample point value left before being shifted once to the right afterward. So the maximum number is 12, resulting in a value being shifted left 11 times, and the minimum is 0, resulting in a value being shifted right once, which isn't very useful. The last bit in the header byte is the end flag bit, which denotes if this is the last block in the sample. The next to last bit is the loop flag bit, which determines what happens when the last block is reached. If this bit is cleared, the current note will just stop playing. If the bit is set, instead of fetching the next BRR block from ARAM immediately after this block, the address in the directory for the loop point is used. The sound sample can just continue looping forever until it is turned off via software. The remaining 2 bits are for the differential filter mode. This is where that differential coding comes back into play. We can create a formula for the value of the current PCM sample point given the values in the BRR block. The sample point value is equal to 2 to the power of the shift range minus 1 multiplied by the 4-bit BRR sample point value. And this is all floored to an integer value. This is what filter mode 0 does. It behaves as if there were no filter in place at all. Each sample point is strictly what is found in the BRR sample, shifted by that range value. Filter mode 1 is a first-order filter that uses the value of the previous sample point in the calculation for the new sample point. In particular, the value of the previous sample point, multiplied by 15/16, is added to the current sample point value. Filter modes 2 and 3 are second-order filters and use the previous sample point as well, with different constants. Using these filter modes allows the PCM sample points to not be constrained by the same quantization as the values in the BRR sample are. The fractional constants allow for the processed sample points to slip in between the quantization steps and even go outside the bounds of the minimum and maximum values normally allowed for a given quantization range. Arithmetic overflow can occur during this step, but a properly formed BRR sample would make sure that this would never happen. So this is how the DSP decodes a BRR sample, one sample point at a time. But how is note pitch achieved? The sample rate of the DSP is 32 kHz, so this is what BRR samples should be expected to be sampled at as well. If one sample point is processed per sample cycle, the sound sample will play at the same frequency that it was recorded at. However, if the sample points are processed quicker, the pitch will go up, and if the sample points are processed slower, the pitch will go down. For example, if a sound sample were recorded at 32 kHz but played back at 64 kHz, it would sound 1 octave higher than the original recorded sound, since the sample rate is now twice as fast. Of course, the DSP can only output at 32 kHz, so instead, sample points are skipped. In this case, every other sample point would be processed. When the pitch of a note goes up, sample points have to be skipped as we march through the BRR sample faster and faster. And when the pitch of a note goes down, sample points are processed more than once as we march through slower and slower. What determines exactly how fast the sample point is processed? The pitch registers. There are 8 voices, and each one has a 14-bit pitch register that determines the speed at which a sound sample gets processed on that particular voice. A value of hex 1000 corresponds to 1 sample point per sample cycle of the DSP. This can go as high as hex 3FFF, or just shy of 4 sample points per sample cycle, which results in the sample being played 2 octaves higher than the original. And it can go as low as 0, which means 0 sample points per sample cycle, which is sort of like extending the sample out to infinity and you wouldn't be able to hear it at all. Which means there isn't really a bound on how low a note can go. This value is often treated as a 2.12 fixed point decimal number, where the lower 12 bits are the fractional part and the upper 2 bits are the unsigned integer part, ranging from 0 to 3. In this format, the number would represent how big each step is and how quickly the BRR sample is processed in terms of number of sample points. The fractional part just allows for more precision for the in-between values, so you aren't just limited to multiples of the base frequency of the original sample. The DSP has internal circuitry by means of a counter or a clock to keep track of this fractional part and process the proper number of sample points per cycle. For example, a value of hex 800 would mean that 1 sample point is processed during one cycle, then no new sample points on the next, and this pattern repeats. It also takes into account the possibility of the pitch value changing over time, in the case of pitch bends and vibrato. The fractional part is also used in the interpolation step, which we'll get to in just a moment. The maximum pitch values means that, at most, 4 BRR sample points will need to be processed in a single sample cycle. The DSP has a small buffer inside to hold the currently processing sample point, as well as a few extra as part of the BRR decoding and interpolation. When the pitch is high, it is common that a particular individual BRR sample point isn't processed directly, but is part of the calculations for a sample point following it, since with a higher order filter, 3 contiguous sample points are required to get the resulting PCM sample as output. So we can process a sample at varying speeds, which results in its pitch being shifted up or down. However, in order to get a finer resolution of pitch values, we have to process sample points at a fractional rate. That is, we might want to use the value of the BRR sample at a point in between where the individual samples were taken in time. This means we need some sort of interpolation algorithm. For example, if we were playing a note at a pitch with value hex 400, 2 octaves down, we would be processing the BRR sample at a rate of 1 sample point every 4 sample cycles. We could just output each sample point 4 times in a row, but that ends up sounding pretty funky. What we should do is interpolate between each of the sample points. A quick and easy way to do this would be linear interpolation. A point halfway between 2 sample points would just be the average value of those 2 points, and a point 1/4 of the way would be the average of that sample point and the midpoint. By linearly interpolating like this, we end up with a much smoother resulting waveform. This works decently well, but it ends up not being very smooth with very low pitches. We can start to see all of the interpolation between sample points with all of the angled lines instead of a smooth curve. This is why the DSP uses 4-point Gaussian interpolation instead. The basis of Gaussian interpolation and why it works is outside the scope of this video, but I can at least explain how it works. Instead of using 2 input points and interpolating between them, we look at all of the points of the sound sample and create a weighted sum of them all, where points closer to the point of interest are weighted higher. These weights fall on a bell curve normal distribution. If the point of interest falls directly on a sample point, it has the highest weight right in the middle of the bell curve. And the further away it is, the smaller the weight, and therefore the lesser effect it has on the total sum. Now, there is one main problem with implementing this within the DSP via hardware. That is that we don't have a buffer of the entire decoded BRR sample at once, so we can't possibly find a weighted sum of all of the points. The buffer only holds a small working portion of the BRR sample, somewhere around 12 sample points. So we can really only get a weighted sum of at most 12 sample points instead of the hundreds of points in the entire BRR sample. Due to how the buffer is filled as the sample is processed, it's possible that only 4 of these sample points are up to date, while the other 8 are old and currently being replaced with new data from the BRR decoding process. Thankfully, we can shape our bell curve so that it drops off rather quickly, which means all of those weights we would be missing would be so close to 0 that it wouldn't be a terrible thing to just leave them out entirely. So here is the exact interpolation method the DSP uses. It contains a lookup table for the weights of this bell curve. It has 1024 entries, although since this curve is symmetrical, the table only needs to be 512 entries long. Each entry is an 11-bit unsigned integer. We spread this out across the 4 input sample points, which means we have a resolution of 256 steps between each sample point. The internal counter or clock associated with the pitch is used to determine where within this range we sample the bell curve. Those higher 4 bits are the integer part of the fixed point number, and those correspond to the sample index within the buffer. But the other 12 bits can be used as the fractional part in between the sample points. Now, we only have 256 steps between each sample point for the bell curve, so only the middle 8 bits are used as an index into this bell curve lookup table. The lowest 4 bits are never used in a calculation, but they are still there to help increase the pitch resolution. If we call this fractional part x, we can see that the first sample point should index into the lookup table at 255 minus x, and the second point at 511 minus x. The third sample point uses index 256 plus x, since the curve is reversed on this side, and the fourth point just uses index x. The 15-bit sample points are multiplied with the 11-bit bell curve values, then the top 16 bits of each result are summed together. And the final result is cut in half to make a 15-bit value, which is what is fed to the voice mixer. There can possibly be some overflow errors in this step, which can potentially cause clicks and pops in the audio stream, which can be avoided with a properly formed BRR sample. And yeah, don't forget that not only is all of this taking place each sample cycle, but this is happening 8 times in a row, one for each of the 8 voices. In case this was a bit confusing, let's do a small example. Here are the first 2 blocks of a BRR encoded sample, and just for reference, here's what that looks like decoded. Here is our 12 sample point buffer for this voice, and let's say we want to play a note a perfect fifth lower than the base frequency. To do that, we multiply the base pitch value of hex 1000 by 2/3, which gives us hex AAE. When a new note is keyed on, the first thing that happens is that the buffer is filled up with the first 12 sample points. This first block has a header that denotes that it is using a shift value of 9 and a filter mode of 0. Because this is the first block and there are no previous sample points, a BRR sample should always start with a filter mode of 0, since another internal buffer that handles the BRR decoding is not initialized to 0 at the start of a new note. It's possible that old sample data from a different note could be used in the decoding calculations if the first block uses a filter other than filter 0. Filter 0 is easy to calculate though. We take the 4-bit value of the first 12 sample points and shift them left by the shift value -1, so 8 times. Upon key on, the internal pitch counter is also initialized to 0. Every sample cycle, which consists of 32 machine cycles, we take the upper nibble of the pitch counter and add 1, 2, and 3 to it, wrapping around at 12 if we reach the end of the buffer. These are the 4 sample points that are used in the interpolation calculation. The middle 8 bits are used as the bell curve lookup table index. In this case, the result of the interpolation is just 0. In order to not have a click or pop when a note starts playing, the first few sample points of a BRR sample should be 0. This is because the interpolation step for the very first sample point includes the first 4 decoded BRR samples as input, and in order to create a smooth sound, a sample should start from the baseline 0. This result is what gets passed on to the mixing phase. The pitch counter is incremented by the pitch value, hex AAE. If the pitch counter reaches hex C000 or greater, it resets back to 0 to the start of the buffer. Also, if the pitch counter crosses a 4 sample boundary in the buffer, a new set of 4 sample points are decoded from the BRR sample. So on the second sample cycle here, the same 4 sample points are used in the calculation, except our bell curve index is now hex AA. This results in an output sample point of hex F. The pitch counter increases to hex 155C for the next cycle. This time, the highest nibble of the pitch counter is 1, so now we shift over to the next set of 4 samples in the interpolation calculation, and our bell curve index is hex 55. This results in an output sample point of hex 6F. The pitch counter increases again to hex 200A. Now we're at the next set of sample points with an index of 0, resulting in hex 1BB. The pitch counter increases to hex 2AB8. Same set of sample points this time, since we didn't roll over, with an index of hex AB, resulting in hex 3F8. Pitch counter is now hex 3566. Next set of sample points, an index of hex 56, results in hex 4D5. Pitch counter is now hex 4014. Now, since we are past that 4 sample boundary, the next 4 sample points are piped into the buffer. Then we just keep going. Next set of sample points, index of 1, results in hex 283. Pitch counter increases to hex 4AC2. Same set of sample points, index of hex AC, results in negative hex 1F7. Pitch counter increases to hex 5570. Next set of sample points, index of hex 57, results in negative hex 3C7. Pitch counter increases to hex 601E. Next set of sample points, index of 1, results in negative hex 10E. Pitch counter increases to hex 6ACC. Same set of sample points, index of hex AC, results in hex 381. Pitch counter increases to hex 757A. Next set of sample points, index of hex 57, results in hex 612. Pitch counter increases to hex 8028. Past the next 4 sample boundary, so we pipe in 4 more sample points. These sample points are coming from the second BRR block. This block uses a shift value of 8 and filter mode 3. Filter mode 3 includes the previous 2 PCM buffer values in the calculation for the current one. So this first sample point of hex A, or negative 6, gets shifted left 8-1, or 7 times to get negative hex 300. Then the negative hex 200 is multiplied by 115 over 64 and added to the result to get negative hex 698. And the sample before that, hex 300, is multiplied by 13 over 16, and that gets subtracted from the result, which ends up being negative hex 908. The rest of the samples are processed in this way. And so the cycle continues. Keep marching through the buffer at a rate equal to the current pitch value, which can be changed at any time, and piping in new samples as needed. The DSP also has a pitch modulation feature, which takes the output waveform values in this step and treats them as the pitch values for a subsequent voice. We'll look at that more in a later video. For now, I'll let this animation finish playing out. Now that a handful of output samples have been created, you can see that the resulting waveform is similar to the source BRR sample, just stretched out by a factor of 2/3. Thank you for watching. The next video in this series will look at the mixing process and how the outputs we saw in this video from all 8 voices are merged into a single stereo output. That's where we'll also touch on the pitch modulation feature I mentioned earlier. There's also a seldom used noise generator that we'll look at too. If you would like to support the channel, consider joining these generous folks by subscribing to the RGME Patreon or Subscribestar pages. Patrons get ad-free early access to videos and even some behind-the-scenes content. I rely more on the help I get from these places than what I get here on YouTube, so I really appreciate any and all support, no matter how small. Thank you so much, and stay tuned for the next video.